You're listening to The Leonard Lopate Show on AM 820 and 93.9 WNYC.
Winston Churchill was a larger-than-life character, and in the new film Darkest Hour, Gary Oldman certainly does him justice and more in a finely nuanced portrayal of the British Prime Minister during the very early days of World War II. Perfect foil for him in it is Kristin Scott Thomas, who plays his wife Clemmy, and the award-winning Joe Wright directed it, so I'm delighted to welcome all three of them now to this special broadcast from the Green Space. Hello. Hello. Gary, didn't you turn down a chance to play Churchill a number of years ago?
Yes, one floated by in, I think, 2014, and I let it float by.
Because you just didn't think you were right for it, or you didn't like the script?
A number of things, but it just seemed, at the time, it just seemed a sort of crazy idea. I mean, although I must say I have a striking resemblance to him, I could see why. No, it just wasn't the right time, the right project, and there was no director at the time, and it wasn't a good fit. And then this came to me, and I had much the same mind. But it was with Joe, and it was collaborating again with Eric Fellner, who we had started our careers together when he was a young man at Working Title, and we did a little film called Sid and Nancy together. And so this time, the script, director, the producer, the company, it all felt a good fit. Yeah.
Kristin, how much did you know about the Churchills or this particular period of the war before you signed on?
Very little. I mean, Churchill.
Don't they teach us in school in England?
No. Well, they certainly don't teach you how close we were to being invaded by Hitler and how being ruled by. It was so close we were to becoming part of that sort of empire. Certainly didn't teach you that. But of course, Churchill is I think in the whole world, everybody knows what he looks like and don't know much more about him. There are always films being made about him. In fact, I've been asked to play Clemmy more than once.
Clementine, his wife.
Clementine. And didn't want to either until Joe came along with this project.
When Churchill's name is mentioned, it tends to summon up images of him much later in the war, before he became an icon. How unlikely a candidate for prime minister was he at the time, Joe?
He was the last person his own party wanted. He was the only candidate that the Labour Party would agree to entering into a coalition with.
The only Tory.
Yeah. The only Tory that the Labour Party would agree to enter a coalition with, which is I mean,
they saw him as more liberal than some of the other Tories?
he'd been a member of the Liberal Party, an MP for the Liberal Party for 10 years, I think, and then had moved back into the Conservative Party. So he was considered to be more liberal. He was considered to be less establishment. And also his record of calling out Hitler, which he'd been doing, throughout the 30s, was considered to be very, very important to the Labour Party, who were far more anti-appeasement than the Tories were.
So one of the appeals is he wasn't Neville Chamberlain.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, why were a majority faction in the British government opposed to going to war against Hitler? Was it just simply they didn't want to go to war?
I think so. I think the Second World War always has to be seen in the context of the First World War. It was only 24 years between the two wars, and an entire generation had been wiped out in that First World War. So I think both in this country and in the UK, people were very, very reticent to go back to that horror, really, and also they didn't really understand the true nature of Hitler and the Nazi Party. I think that's safe to say. I mean, Churchill saw it firsthand. There was a kind of desire to turn a blind eye, really, I believe.
Gary and Kristin, do you, in preparing for roles like this, do you do a lot of research? Do you read books?
Well, I'll answer, because my answer will be much quicker than Gary's, because I mean, yes, obviously there's a lot has been written about Clementine, and I was able to talk to her grandchildren and look at if there isn't very much footage of her. There are one or two recordings of her voice. But it's such a fascinating period, and she was such a fascinating woman that research was just a joy. I mean, I absolutely loved it.
Yes, it was it was fun to research, and my curiosity for it will continue. Continues now. But it was. I had a little under a year, really, to sort of work on it and think about it, and that, as you would imagine, it involved as much reading as I could. We had sort of behind the velvet rope tours of Blenheim and Chartwell and Downing Street and the war rooms. So you're sort of soaking up that atmosphere. I went to a lot of the newsreel footage of the period, and as you said earlier about Churchill being a sort of older man, he's often those are the years that are sort of represented, and he's sort of shuffling around in his monogrammed carpet slippers and
with a cigar in his mouth.
With a cigar in his mouth.
Do you smoke cigars?
No, I don't smoke cigars. So, but that's how he's been represented, and in this period, 1940. Going to the footage, I saw a more robust, vital, energized man.
Did he have the support of King George the Sixth?
Not initially, no. The king, over time, warmed to him, but one of the terrible things, of course, he did. One of the no things that you don't do is he supported the king's brother's marriage, and basically said, well, surely you'll be able, you can fall in love with who you care. I mean, you're the king. I mean, if you're a king and you can't marry the woman that you love, then what's the point in being king?
Joe, I love the way we see Churchill and the king's relationship develop over time in very unlikely ways. Why do you think that happened?
Because it became clearer and clearer to everyone the stark dilemma of what they were facing, and I think when his courtiers started suggesting that he have to evacuate to Canada. I think it was Canada that did it, actually. It was the suggestion of moving to Canada that made the king come round to Churchill's point of view.
I'm speaking with Joe Wright, who directed Darkest Hour, which opens next Wednesday, the 22nd, at the Lincoln Square and Regal Union Square theaters, with Gary Oldman, who stars as Winston Churchill, and Dame Kristin Scott Thomas, who stars as Clementine, or Clemmy, Churchill. We'll be back with more right after this. And a little later, we will take a look at the first Broadway revival of the Tony-winning play M. Butterfly, with playwright David Henry Hwang and Julie Taymor, who directed it. This is WNYC, WNYC.org.
WNYC supporters include GEICO, offering car insurance as well as services for homeowners and renters insurance through the GEICO Insurance Agency. Additional information can be found at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO. The Museum of the City of New York, located at 103rd and 5th, home to New York at its core, an interactive exhibition exploring New York City's past, present, and imagining its future, open 7 days a week, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Williams, providing energy that heats and powers New York City for over 60 years. More at williams.com/WNYC. WNYC is a media partner for the New York Moth Story Slam, a storytelling competition featuring stories on the theme of revelations. Tonight at Housing Works. Details at themoth.org.
A mandate to some is a tax to others.
Rather than buy the insurance that supposedly we want them to buy, we overprice it and then we penalize them when they can't afford it. So we are going to repeal the tax on poor Americans.
Senate Republicans now say they'll scrap the individual mandate for health insurance and work it into their tax bill. We've got that story, plus how we reached $1.7 trillion in tax cuts. That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
We are back with Joe Wright, the director of Darkest Hour, which opens next Wednesday, the 22nd, at Lincoln Square and Regal Union Square Theaters, and with Gary Oldman, who plays Winston Churchill in it, and Kristin Scott Thomas, who plays his wife, Clemmy Churchill. There's something, Joe, that you wanted to read for us?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you said, why the British didn't respond, or the policy of appeasement and turning the blind eye. And I was just reminded...
Did everything change with Dunkirk? Is that it?
Yes, it did. But I was just reminded of a poem, the Martin Niemöller poem, that goes like this. First they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. And I think there's a kind of that blind eye that Britain turned towards the rise of Nazism. This idea that it would just go away, it would burn itself out.
Instead, they saw it just spread all across Europe.
Exactly.
And they were pretty much the only country left in Western Europe that hadn't been taken over by Hitler.
And Churchill was speaking out all the way from the beginning.
Now, Gary, how do you go about tackling not only a real-life character, but someone who's larger than life and so well-known? And someone who doesn't look 100% like you either.
I have no idea.
Is that what we call acting?
It's called acting, yeah.
Yes, you just hope it's... you, as I say, you obviously you work. You have a text for that. That's really what you start with, because it is, for an actor, a good piece of writing is a sort of your emotional. It's your map of the world, and all the signs and signposts and everything will be there. If it's a good piece of writing, it will be there. So you have this life, at least on the page. You're not sort of starting with a blank canvas. And then you go to the reading and you go to the footage, and then you're working with, we would email and communicate throughout that sort of process before we got to rehearsal. So you're touching base with the director and Joe's, how you're going to fit into Joe's creative vision. So all of that work is going on, and it's just like a big sausage machine. You just put it all in, and then hopefully when you grind it and it comes out at the end, you have a sausage.
Part of the problem, I'd imagine.
So beautifully put.
Yes.
Toulouse sausage.
Well, are we talking about chorizo, kielbasa? Are we talking about
Kielbasa.
Italian sausage?
Yeah. A British banger.
Yes. You were also playing a character whose inflections, his way of speaking is really well known. How do you avoid doing a caricature? The Rich Little version of Churchill.
Well, I think that, people have fallen into that thing of doing da-da-da, da-da-da, that it kind of gets into this sort of rhythm. I saw a piece of footage which is really the only footage of him speaking to someone in his what I would call his normal voice, as opposed to his public voice. And he was doing a sort of one of those sort of political campaign service announcement things, and and it's a bit of outtake where the clapperboard comes in, and he's having a conversation to obviously the director, who is off camera, and there is none of that sound there in his. So the cadence and the rhythms are very much in his rhetoric, in his oratory when he speaks publicly. And what I chose to do was, he also had a speech impediment, so his lisp was very, very pronounced. So you've got to, like you say, you have to go from an impression to a creation. So you ease back on some of the lisping because you would be completely inaudible, and also taking those speech patterns and hitting them every so often, and then the public speaking. The recordings that we have of Churchill were recorded after the event. The BBC probably went to Chartwell, and he sat in bed with a whiskey and a cigar and recorded them. So it was taking those famous speeches and then using one's imagination and saying, well, here's a man who's speaking in the House of, he's in the House of Commons, he's in front of 600 people, and you give it a little more. I imagined he would give it a little more Henry V.
The film contains 3 key speeches that Churchill wrote and delivered over 2 months. But early in the film, when his new secretary, Elizabeth Leighton, played by Lily James, is going to meet him, she's warned that sometimes it may be hard to understand him.
Yeah.
And that's in his normal speech.
That would be in his, yes. I think what he would do is he would turn his back and he would pace up and down the room, and really, when you hear him speaking, it's really quite. So if he turned his back and paced, you would really have to follow. Whereas he's mumbling, looking out the window, the voice would go away, and he would look out the window. So
He's got a big cigar in his mouth,
and
as
a very big cigar in his mouth.
Kristin, Churchill said that marrying Clementine was his most brilliant achievement, but what kind of relationship did they really have? We see all sorts of different aspects of it here.
Well, I think that they were absolutely devoted to one another, but it was quite an intense relationship. I think she was as troubled as he was. She was treated for depression. She had her own kind of things going on. She
had to give up things to be the wife of this prominent figure.
I mean, they had a lot of rows, a lot of really quite serious rows. She found him impossible. He would spend a lot of money that she felt they shouldn't be spending, including buying a house while her back was turned. And I think it was a very long-lasting relationship, and it was a very, very passionate relationship. But it certainly wasn't an easy one.
And after the time period of this film, when the D-Day invasion is being planned, and Churchill is opposed, although everybody else is for it, she gets so upset with the way he's acting, she actually left him. Yeah. But it's thought that she had a real impact on him. Was she his chief advisor?
I don't know if she was an advisor, but I think she managed to keep him on an even keel, as much as possible as an even keel, so that he was able to come to the decisions that he had to.
Were you able to read their letters?
Yeah. There were there's a wonderful collection of letters published by their daughter, Mary Soames. That's right, isn't it? Mm-hmm. which is just fascinating. I mean, there is so much material to dive into. It was quite frightening, the amount of the weight of the books that were sent to me. It was quite impressive. But no, it was just learning all this about them was just riveting.
I think she did advise him as well. She wasn't necessarily she wasn't an official advisor, but her politics were probably more liberal than his at times in terms of home policy, and from what I understand, she did advise him and guide him or get angry with him when she felt that he was wrong.
How involved were you, Joe, in writing the script?
Well, it's always a difficult question.
Well, directors can take a script and make it into whatever they want to make it into.
Yeah, I mean, there was a great screenplay that to start with that I was sent, and the structure was pretty much there. And then I worked on the screenplay for about 6 months with Anthony McCartan, the writer, honing and trying to bring out of it the elements that I felt were most dramatic and cinematic and what interested me, really. The roles of the women weren't so forward in that original script, and although I kind of was interested in making a film with lots of men in it, because that's not usually the kind of film I make, I couldn't quite face having no women, so we kind of worked on Clementine's character and Elizabeth Layton as well, making sure that they were that the women had a voice in the movie, and I was really interested in the issues of doubt and the kind of moment of a crisis, really, that Churchill has. So I kind of went into that a bit more. It's dangerous with Churchill. He came out with so many good lines, and so it's very dangerous. You have to resist the temptation of it becoming like Churchill's greatest hits, and kind of crowbarring great Churchill lines in for no reason other than they're great Churchill lines.
Were you able to shoot wherever you wanted?
We got to shoot outside number 10 Downing Street, which was shocking to me, actually. I was very surprised about that, and it was really, really exciting. We were given permission to shoot inside the House of Commons, but they said that only democratically elected bottoms were allowed to sit on the benches. No one would be allowed to sit down.
But Gary, you could stride across the House of Commons as though you owned them. That must have been a thrill.
It was great fun being there, and also being on Downing Street. I mean, usually the exterior of the door and the windows and the brick and everything else is normally built in films, and it's a facade, but to actually be walking in, I walked when we were doing the takes of me pulling up and walking in and then coming out and then resetting and then pulling up and walking in and walking out. I think by the end of the day I walked in and out of that building more than the actual Churchill.
You've said that this was the hardest job you've ever done as an actor. Is that partly also because you don't bear a physical resemblance? How many prosthetics were you wearing while you were shooting this?
All in all, 48 consecutive days, and the whole process took, the whole thing took just under 4 hours. So I think it might be a world record.
That you had to suit up. Costumes are really important in a film like this. You're nodding your head, Kristin. Do costumes actually help you get into the character?
I mean, I think that's the first step towards finding your character, is finding its outside. You can sort of go outside and then in. We were very lucky with Jacqueline Duran to have somebody who understood the fabrics and the cuts, and who managed to maintain a kind of elegance. I mean, Clemmy was incredibly careful about the way she dressed. She would make her own clothes and her own hats. She'd worked in a hat shop before she married Winston. and she was often teased for that because she only did it because she was broke. So anyway, so the costumes were very, very important for me to be able to get into that character. It was an outside-in type thing.
Joe, it's hard to imagine how up against the wall Churchill was when all of his troops were stranded perilously at Dunkirk. That period comes vividly to life in this film.
Yeah, it's a period that I'm really interested in. I did a movie called Atonement, and there was a big Dunkirk sequence in that as well. Only the British really can turn what was basically the worst crushing defeat our army had ever known into somehow a victory.
As we saw in the most recent version of Dunkirk.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it kind of looms large in the British consciousness, really.
And in the end, it is the reason that Churchill was allowed to lead Britain into World War II.
Yeah, is it? I'm not sure.
Is that the turning point?
No, I think the turning point was later with the Battle of Britain. Mm-hmm. I think that once, that was the moment when we understood that the Germans weren't going to invade, and therefore we could, pursue the war. Really.
On the other hand, I was in London in 1960-61, and you saw many places, even then, that had been destroyed by the Blitz.
Absolutely, I used to
it
play
was
in
very
bomb craters when I was a
long-lasting.
kid. Yeah.
So that
was-
must have been a determining factor to have neighborhoods blown up.
The war was still very much. I was born in 1958, so my mother would have walked me to school, in the early 60s, and you would see in the working class neighborhoods, terraced houses. You would see 3 terraced houses, and then you would see a hole, 2 holes where there were once buildings. Then you would, around the corner there would be another block of houses, and then a whole block that was missing. So you saw, growing up, you were very aware of what East London, South East London, North London had been through during the war. It's very much in the air.
You mentioned, Joe, that you made Atonement. You also made Pride and Prejudice. I think to some degree that could be a title for half the movies made in the world right now. But do you see any links between the films you do, other than you were the director?
Yeah, I do. They're all about people trying to communicate with each other, or more often than not, miscommunicate with each other. It's about how people relate to each other and reach out to each other somehow. Yeah.
And do you communicate that to your actors? Did Kristin and Gary, were you thinking in your scenes, well, we're both trying to communicate and we're miscommunicating at the same time?
No, it's not something I'm overt about. It's just something that I've noticed. I mean, there are other things I've noticed. They're also kind of generally about sort of odd people, or kind of people who don't really fit in, holy fools or that type.
But you go with instincts,
Yeah.
and it's an instinctual thing. You don't always... There are some scenes, for instance, and not in Darkest Hour and over one's career, where you need to really analyse and walk through a scene, and there are other scenes and moments where the 2 actors click and they find the rhythm and an innate instinctual understanding of it, and it plays, and you don't even have to say anything. I mean, there were times when Joe would come up to me, and we'd do a couple of takes, and he would come up and he'd say, it just needs a bit more like that, and I'd go, yeah, I know what you mean.
Darkest Hour opens next Wednesday, the 22nd, at the Lincoln Square and Regal Union Square Theaters. My great thanks to Gary Oldman, who stars as Winston Churchill, and Kristin Scott Thomas, who stars as Clemmy Churchill, and to Joe Wright, who directed the film. It's been a real pleasure having you on our show here in the Green Space.